What do you make of
Thank
the
you.
Prime Minister's comments this week? They were quite extraordinary, comparing this time to the 30s and 40s. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's understandable he should say that, but I think the history is a little different from that. What you saw in the 30s and 40s was an extension of what happened during the very first decade, first 2 decades of the 20th century. And essentially what happened there was you saw the rise of Germany as a new great power post the unification of Germany in 1871. And this new great power was a challenge to the status quo powers, Great Britain, France, and Russia. And this led ultimately to the First World War. And frankly, I think the First World War led to the Second World War, was an extension of it. So the 30s was all tied up with that historic phenomenon. Where I think there is a comparison, and so it's a bit different, where I think there is a comparison is you do have now the rise of a great power, a new great power being China. And what China has to learn, and we all have to learn, are the lessons of what happened when Germany emerged as a great power from 1871 onwards. So China, we have to respect and understand its new power. It needs to have a substantial and proportionate say in global governance. On the other hand, China itself has to understand the sensitivities that the status quo powers, particularly the United States, but countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Australia, the sensitivities we have, and not project itself as a newly powerful country which has decided it's going to bully other people, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And I spent a bit of time telling you that, but what worries me is that China is starting to bully, is starting to behave, I think inappropriately, and is causing more and more concern amongst what I might call the status quo powers, the Western alliance. And this is not a good trajectory. This is heading in all the wrong directions.
Mr. Downer, when you talk about the concern of China and how it is becoming more belligerent and more bullying in its attitude, what are you most worried about? Is it a traditional military attack, or is it warfare that takes another form?
So it's a different thing. It's the attempt by China, in particular in the Indo-Pacific region, to exercise more and more influence and reduce countries in the Indo-Pacific region to subjugation, to being vassal states. That's probably putting it about as strongly as I could. What we need in the Indo-Pacific region is not countries being subjected to Chinese influence. I don't mean military occupation. I just mean sheer influence and acting at the will of China because they fear the consequences of not acting, particularly economic consequences of not acting to the will of China. What we need in the Indo-Pacific region is a proper balance of power. So we need a strong United States in the Indo-Pacific region. We need strength between America's allies and the Americans. So that is Japan, Australia, the two most important allies. And then friends of the Western alliance like Indonesia, Singapore, and of course, very importantly, India. These countries need increasingly to collaborate, not to try to contain China, but to make sure that we maintain an appropriate balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. That is the challenge for us, and that's I think that's where Scott Morrison's being very wise, because he's talking about Australia having the military capacity to provide deterrence, and Australia having the diplomatic capacity to play that role as a balance of power participant in the region.
Yeah, and I think we've seen during the coronavirus pandemic that while China was on the path of the vassal states and subjugation of some of these other areas. You know, they've even taken further strategic advantage of the pandemic to extend aid and loans and other things, you know, to places like the Pacific. But look, I want to ask you, if you were running foreign policy now, how would you handle this? There's an argument from Labor that our heated rhetoric, that the strong rhetoric of the government and particularly some of its outspoken MPs is actually exacerbating the tensions in Australia's relationship with China and that they should just tone it down. But others argue it's essential to stand up to China. What's your view on how this should be handled?
Well, in the main, the government in Beijing is not going to be too fussed about what individual backbenchers may say, to be frank, not to be disrespectful to them. But I noticed the Labor Party, targeting things that certain backbenchers have said. Well, I mean, it's not important. It's that's just partisanship. I don't think that's important. What's important is what the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister say. And of course, the Chinese will be following that very closely. And it seems to me the position to take is to make it perfectly clear to China where we stand. And that is, we're happy to collaborate with China. We're happy to trade with China. We're happy to have political engagement with China. We don't want to isolate China, or, as to use the term of the Cold War, contain China. On the other hand, we're not going to be told what to do by China, and we're not going to be told how to run our political system, and we're not going to put up with cyber attacks on Australian institutions, be they private sector or public sector institutions. So they just have to understand what the terms of our engagement are. They use the term themselves about the term mutual respect. Well, that's our expectation of the Chinese. Of course, we respect China as a great power, but we expect them to give respect to Australia. Australia, after all, is something like the sixth oldest continuously operating democracy in the world.
Yeah.
Don't try to challenge our democratic credentials. I mean, that is a silly thing to do.
Yeah. Mr. Downer, just very quickly, and with complete respect, do you think past governments, including the one you were part of, underestimated the threat from China or failed to see it to its full extent?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's a very respectful question. And I think the answer is that past governments pretty much did the right thing. But past governments weren't dealing with the China of 2020. We were dealing, the Howard government was ejected from office in 2007. So at that time, when Hu Jintao was the president of China, China was a much more respectful and engaging partner to deal with. Though we had our problems with China, certainly. But I think we got the balance pretty much right during that time. And we were very frank with Chinese leaders, be it Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or their foreign ministers and so on. We didn't hold back in telling them what our view of the world was and what the terms of our engagement should be. But what has happened since is nothing to do with Australia. It's everything to do with Beijing, that Xi Jinping has become the president of China. His government has engaged in what they like to call wolf warrior diplomacy. Ambassadors have been exceptionally rude about their host governments. They've started using economic levers to try to threaten other countries, including us. Punishment is meted out left, right and centre. And you've seen what's happened in Hong Kong. I mean, it all worked okay, not brilliantly, but it all worked okay up until they suddenly decided that they were going to basically change the terms of the joint declaration between the UK and China over the future of Hong Kong and start to impose their will on Hong Kong. So, this is a much more aggressive government than the government of China that we had to deal with when I was the foreign minister. Yeah. So a more difficult challenge for the government.
Okay, and just before you go, Mr. Downer, you've encouraged the government and government ministers to stop appearing on the ABC's Q&A. Why is this?
Well, maybe not always, but I was watching Q&A, last Monday night, And to be honest, I don't very often. I mean, I live in London most of the time anyway, but I don't very often watch Q&A. But I just happened to be watching it this last week, and they had one government minister, Paul Fletcher, the communications minister, who I thought, he did a very good job. He's a good performer. And they had everybody else lined up against him, including the people who phoned in. I mean, it's not a question of whether you agree with Paul Fletcher or the government or whether you don't. It's that it was just totally one-sided. I mean, I often have thought over the years that on Q&A, they put on a token conservative, and then they basically line them up and ridicule them.
And smash them for the whole rest of the program.
Having a balanced discussion. I mean, I think it's quite a good format. They have one in the UK as well. I think it's called Any Questions. But they should model themselves, or they sort of tried to model themselves on the BBC model, but they should do that by making it balanced.
Fair enough.
I mean, I'm not closing down debate. Don't want to discourage all sorts of left-wing opinions being expressed, but surely centre-right people are entitled to a bit of an expression of opinion as well every so often.